If I told you that some of the most notorious and brutal guards of the Second World War, such as Irma Grese, the hyena of Auschwitz, and Josef Kramer, the beast of Belsen, were still buried on Earth, you wouldn't believe me, and they were actually exhumed years after their date with the executioner, to give them what was referred to, in some senses, as a decent burial. But this is the case, and the executed guards of Bergen-Belsen, along with many other war criminals who were dispatched on the gallows within Hamlin Prison, lie inside of a graveyard close to the former prison, where they took their last breaths. At the end of the Second World War, the Allies came across the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen, and they uncovered a sight of true horror and evil, as over 10,000 unburied corpses lay scattered around Belsen, and the SS guards who remained there had not bothered to bury the deceased, and many were lying where they fell because of the brutal conditions of the camp. But amongst the prisoners who were liberated were found many SS guards. Some were killed by the inmates as they turned on them, but the most high-profile ones were brought to trial. Some were condemned to death, as it was found that they had slaughtered prisoners inside some of the deadliest camps of the Third Reich and the Second World War. But what happened to the bodies of the former guards executed following the Belsen Trials? Welcome to The Untold Past. To support our channel, please make sure to click subscribe. Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was originally set up as a prisoner of war camp, but then in 1943 it became a fully fledged concentration camp, and it was a site where during the Second World War, untold horror would be carried out by the SS guards. Over time a women's camp was set up there, alongside the main camp, and thousands of prisoners were sent there. In December 1944, SS Hauptsturmführer Josef Kramer was sent there, and he was known for being a barbaric man, as he had been the commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the main extermination element of the deadliest camp of the Third Reich. But then Kramer oversaw Belsen in the final years until it was liberated, and things got incredibly tough there. Heinrich Himmler had issued orders for not a single prisoner to fall into the hands of the enemy, as in the Allies, and with this thousands of prisoners were sent to other sites such as Auschwitz to Belsen, and the conditions inside of Belsen crumbled, as a site which was supposed to house 10,000 prisoners became home to roughly 60,000 people. The conditions caused a huge strain on the food supplies, and prisoners had little to no food or access to water or toilets and other facilities. But one of the biggest killers at Belsen was diseases such as typhus and tuberculosis that swept through the site with ruthlessness. It's believed that roughly 70,000 of the 120,000 people that passed through Belsen died due to the conditions, and this included Anne Frank and her sister Margot. Prisoners were overseen by many brutal guards, who remained to inflict suffering and evil onto the inmates at the camp. A large number of prisoners found themselves executed at Belsen through different means, such as lethal injections of phenol to the heart and beatings at the hands of the guards. There were no gas chambers set up at Belsen, but thousands died at the camp, and every week thousands of people themselves were succumbing to the conditions. It was truly hell on earth, but in April 1945, Heinrich Himmler agreed to hand the camp over to the Allies without a fight, and he hurriedly told the SS guards to try and cover up their crimes and to bury some of the dead, but they could not do this. The camp was liberated on the 15th of April 1945, and what was discovered was terrifying. It showed the Nazis had no limits to their evil, and a BBC reporter stated during the liberation that, "Here over an acre of ground lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and with no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. Babies had been born here, tiny wizened things that could not live. A mother driven mad screamed at a British sentry to give her milk for her child, and thrust a tiny mite into his arms and then ran off, crying terribly. This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life." The British and Canadian liberators, to begin with, did not have the manpower to clear up the camp, and also the only person arrested was Josef Kramer, the commandant, who proudly gave the Allies a tour of his site. But within the prisoner population were a number of guards who were hiding out, hoping to avoid capture and to then make a run for it. These were quickly handed over to the Allies, and many former guards were then ordered to help clean up the camp. They were ordered to bury the corpses which were found all around the site in mass graves, and many of the female guards who were ordered to do this complained that they would catch typhus or some other form of disease, but the British patrolled over these guards and ordered them to help in their large clean-up operation. A number of large mass graves were needed to do this. Eventually, prisoners were given treatment and care by the liberators and by specialist medical units who were brought to the camp, and Belsen was then burned to the ground to prevent the spread of further diseases. But those guards who were seized inside of Bergen-Belsen were under arrest, and they were then brought to the Belsen trial. The first trial was officially called the Trial of Josef Kramer and 44 others, and the defendants were 45 former SS men and women, including former prisoner functionaries or capos who had worked at Bergen-Belsen and also Auschwitz. Kramer was defendant number 1, and he was the commandant of the site, known as the Beast of Belsen, and there were 16 female SS guards who were also tried. This included Irma Grese, who is known as the Hyena of Auschwitz, Johanna Bormann and Elisabeth Volkenrath, along with Hertha Bofer and other women who were known for committing a huge degree of evil within the camps. Fritz Klein, the camp doctor at Belsen, along with Franz Hössler, the deputy camp commandant, were also part of the defendants. The trial lasted 54 days, and it began on the 17th of September 1945, and sentencing then occurred on the 17th of November 1945, 4 days after closing arguments were made. There were 11 defendants who were condemned to death for their actions, and these were Josef Kramer, Fritz Klein, Peter Weingartner, a brutal guard, Franz Hössler, Karl Franzot, a cook in the kitchens and SS squad leader, Ansgard Pieschen, who was head of the camp kitchen, Franz Stoeffel, the commandant of a subcamp, but also a leader on a number of death marches, Wilhelm Dürr, who was also part of the death marches, Irma Grese, the brutal female guard, Elisabeth Volkenrath, a senior female guard, and Johanna Bormann, who was known as a woman with the dog of Auschwitz. These defendants had all been found guilty of executing and causing death within Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen or on the death marches, and with this they were sent to Hamelin prison to await their date with the executioner. There were many appeals for clemency lodged for these men and women, but they all had their death sentences confirmed. The condemned guards of Bergen-Belsen were sent to Hamelin prison, which was under British occupation at the time, and they were to sit on death row for a number of weeks until their executions were to be carried out. It was the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint who came over from England to carry out the executions, and he in the days before the executions met with every single one of the condemned Belsen guards. He did this as he needed to calculate the weight and height of each of the men and women to then work out the drop needed to snap their necks using the long drop method as they plunged through the gallows. During these encounters, Pierrepoint made a number of astute observations about the men and women, and he was surprised that a couple of the women he was there to hang were just young women in their 20s. The executions of the guards of the Belsen Trials took place on the 13th of December 1945 within the execution chamber. One by one, Albert Pierrepoint and his assistant summoned the guards to the gallows, and he fetched them from their small cells near to the execution structure. The first to be executed were the women, Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath and Johanna Bormann, and each were taken into the chamber and led up to the gallows. They then had the noose and a white cap placed over their heads. The noose was tightened around their neck, and Pierrepoint shuffled them over a trapdoor, and he had made a chalk X on this to ensure that they fell through the trap properly. Death occurred immediately, as Pierrepoint's calculations were correct, and the necks of the condemned snapped as a rope went taut. There were simultaneous gallows inside the chamber used, allowing Pierrepoint to hang the condemned quicker, and following the women's executions, he then got to work on the men. Josef Kramer and the others were hanged in pairs, and then following the trapdoor being opened, they were left for some time before a doctor declared death. Their remains were then cut down, and they were placed inside of a coffin ready for burial. The interesting thing with this is that the executed guards of Bergen-Belsen were actually to be buried, and they were not cremated like many other Nazi war criminals were. The American military tended to cremate the bodies and then scatter the ashes, but the British opted for burial. The bodies were then buried inside of the prison courtyard within Hamelin prison, and let's remember that these were some of the most despicable war criminals of the Second World War, and they were evil beasts who were responsible for the deaths of thousands. Their bodies were quickly buried, and the graves had already been dug. They remained in these graves for a number of years, but as the process of denazification continued throughout Germany, the time then came for the British to hand Hamlin Prison back to the German people and the local authorities. There were a number of worries inside of Germany, as there was a concern that right-wing groups would worship the remains of prominent SS guards as heroes. In March 1954, the decision to exhume the bodies of the executed guards of the Belsen Trials was made, and the ground was broken inside the prison's courtyard, and the coffins and remains of the different Nazi war criminals who had been executed in Hamlin Prison were found. Amongst the remains were those bodies of 91 different Nazi war criminals, which were then dug up. This included the remains of those condemned at the Belsen Trials, including Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Josef Kramer and the others. One by one the coffins were placed onto the back of a vehicle. They were then taken on a short drive out of the prison to the nearby Hamlin am Vale cemetery, where a large mass grave had been prepared. Some may have needed new coffins to be interred of due to the decomposition process, as they had been in the ground roughly 9 years, and the remains of the executed guards were likely decomposed significantly. One newspaper article at the time claimed British occupation authorities refused to interfere with German authorities who moved the bodies from a mass grave to individual plots in the city cemetery after a campaign by neo-Nazi elements in Hamlin, Lower Saxony. 30 of the 90 bodies of the executed Nazi war criminals have already been moved from a common mass grave near Hamlin and reinterred in the city cemetery. The remaining bodies will be moved later. Amongst those reburied are Josef Kramer, named the Beast of Belsen, by inmates of the notorious death camp, and Irma Grese, who hounded women prisoners at Belsen. Inside of Hamlin's am Vale cemetery, one by one the coffins of the guards of Belsen and the others were lowered into their new grave. There were strict rules at the time to ensure that no memorials were to be placed on the gravesite for the guards of Belsen and the other Nazi war criminals interred. But the authorities then did a U-turn and allowed a small wooden cross to be placed at the gravesite, but people then began to visit the area. Today the remains of the executed guards are still buried inside of the cemetery, meaning that the bodies of Irma Grese, Josef Kramer and the others, who inflicted such suffering and pain onto others during the Second World War, do exist on Earth, and their corpses still remain within the graveyard, close to a path, within a large patch of grass. Today there are calls inside the cemetery to place information plaques, telling who is buried amongst the feet of those who walk to pay their respects to their loved ones inside the cemetery, but there is a concern that there will be many unwanted neo-Nazi visitors who gather at the site to hold rallies like they did previously around the grave of Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer of the Nazi Party. The authorities had to remove Hess's remains eventually from the graveyard because of these gatherings. So today, inside of a cemetery close to the former site of Hamlin Prison, the remains and bodies of those men and women who were executed by the British executioner Albert Pierrepoint do still remain. There was no cremation of their remains, unlike other Nazi war criminals, with their ashes then scattered. This happened, for example, during the Nuremberg trials and following the executions, but instead the bodies were moved when the prison was handed back over to the German authorities in the years after the war, with the Belsen defendants. It is strange that the resting places of people such as Josef Kramer, Fritz Klein, Irma Grese, Johanna Bormann, and the other horrific war criminals can still be visited today, and that this chapter of German history has not been dealt with once and for all. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.